Well, hey, everybody, welcome to 9 o'clock at Washington Heights. So glad you are here. And if today is your first day with us, I would invite you to take a step in the direction of getting connected around here. Right after the service, my wife and I will be just off the platform here. We would love for you to come, say hi, so we can get to know you on a first name basis. Promise I won't keep you long, but would love to just welcome you here as a part of Washington Heights. And then also, just before we jump into the message for today, I want to introduce you to some folks who came all the way from Peru to be a part of Serve Ogden this past week. And we get the privilege of partnering with this couple. They are pastoring a church in Cusco, Peru that is so like-minded to Washington Heights here. And they are doing their own Serve projects right around Christmas time. But they were invited to come here and they've been joining us all week. And they're sitting right over there. And this is Eliseo and his wife Isabel and their son as well. And we are honored to have you. Honored to have you. What a privilege it is to welcome everybody who's been a part of that Serve project. And if you were part of that, thanks for joining that. And I did my part. I broke a GoPro yesterday, running a machine. So I owe you one, a GoPro. But we did the best we could. We're in a series that we have called Greater. We're making our way through a New Testament book called Colossians. And every week we're seeing how Jesus is greater. Greater than what? Greater than everything. And each week we're looking at one of those ways in which he is greater. And before we look at that today, I want to invite you one more time that if you want to receive some devotions through the week, you can text the word devotion to that number every day, Monday through Friday. You will receive via text a link that will take you to a devotion. It's breaking down the passage that we're looking at here on Sunday and allowing us to spend a little more time with it and make it a little bit more personal. But today, let's talk about how Jesus is greater than legalism. And to introduce that, we're going to define that in a moment. And by the end of our time together, I think we'll have a really good handle on what it looks like and why we should avoid it. But as we, dive into this, let me picture for you this way. Was there a time maybe when your faith was alive and vibrant? And it was just living and active and exciting. And it was like it was new and fresh every day. But maybe now it's not vibrant. Maybe it's black and white. And it's kind of devoid of life and meaning. And it just feels like it's a burden. Or maybe you come from a background where you don't have any sort of idea about spirituality or faith. And then you come expecting life with God. But instead it feels like you put a 500-pound backpack on filled with rocks and you're carrying that around. And maybe you wonder, what happened? What happened to the energy and excitement I used to have? What happened to what it's supposed to be like? But then you live in the reality of where you are. Today might explain that if that resonates with you in any way. What happened? It could very well be this issue that we're going to unpack together today. Well, let me start with a couple images here. Boy, this is the stuff we're supposed to eat, right? I don't know about you. I'm not a huge fan, but we're supposed to eat that. Anybody been following the news that there's in some lettuce something called cyclospora? And it's not good for you, right? But you look at this and it looks good, but man, you get some of that other stuff in there and it's really hard to see. You got to take a really, 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 really close look at it. And then it is making a whole lot of people sick. There's also a recall right now going on jalapenos. Why is that? Not all of them. Some of them are containing salmonella, which is also one of those things that if you eat it, that's healthy. But if you get some of the other thing that's in there, it'll make you very, very sick. And we begin with those pictures today because legalism looks so good from a distance. It looks good from the outside. But it is something that can make our faith sick. So what is legalism? Let me give you first a textbook definition of it. Legalism is the attempt to earn God's acceptance, righteousness, or favor through obedience to rules, religious practices, or human standard rather than trusting in God's grace through faith in Jesus. Now that is a mouthful. Let me put it to you maybe in a simpler form. Legalism is the religion of human achievement. It is people trying to work their way into God's good graces. It's what I do makes me right with God. It's what I do plus all the activity that I leverage in God's direction that will make me acceptable or lead my faith forward. And we say, well, what would the opposite of that be? The opposite of human achievement is divine accomplishment. And if you want to know what legalism really is, maybe to just net it out in the most simplest way, it's the word do, D-O. And what we've been learning all along in the beginning of this letter called Colossians is that the Apostle Paul says, no, it's not D-O, it is D-O-N-E. It is what Jesus has done for you that makes you right with God. And the same way that you entered into that relationship by the grace of God, that is how you continue in that relationship, and that is by the grace of God. And in this city called Colossae, to whom this letter was written, there was this fledgling little church of people who were brand new to faith, and along come some teachers, and they, kind of went under this banner called Gnostics, and they came and they said, Jesus is good, but he's like the doorway. He's the entrance into a faith and a relationship with God, and so Jesus is good, but you know what you need to do? You need to do a whole bunch of things. You need to do more, and you need to do better, and there are some things you need to do without. And when you are doing all those things that we will define for you, your faith will go forward. And in this section of this letter, the Apostle Paul takes aim at that whole idea, at the religion of human achievement, and he says, that is going to make your faith sick. So how do we diagnose this? How do we just not go in that direction where our faith will become sick? Well, let's jump into the passage for today, and we're going to make tremendous progress here with one word. So the Apostle Paul starts off this section. He says, therefore. And whenever you see the word therefore, make sure you know what it's there for, because what is about to be said is based on what has just been said. And what is that? In the previous section, this is what we talked about last week. Here's what the Apostle Paul says, the same way you started, that's how you continue. In Jesus, there is all the fullness of deity. Jesus was God in the flesh, and everything that you need is found in him. Who were we all by ourselves? He says, you were dead, spiritually speaking, until he made you alive. What can a dead person do? Nothing. And so it is the work of God. It is divine accomplishment that comes to our rescue and makes us alive to God and allows us to go on a journey together with God. And the same way we journey is the same way that we came, and that is purely and simply by the grace of God. And so these teachers were saying, yeah, it's Jesus plus a whole bunch of things that we will tell you and define for you and show you what they are. And the Apostle Paul comes and says, no, it's Jesus plus nothing. Results in everything. But boy, it's really tempting because it sounds so spiritual and it sounds so committed when we're told that, hey, don't you want a deeper level with God? Well, of course we do. But how does that happen? And how is that something that is part of our relationship with God that's not our doing, but his? So let's spend a little time diagnosing how our faith can get sick. Because in the previous section in which he was saying, here's all the great and positive things that Jesus does to make you alive. Now he's going to talk about the other side of that coin and say, here's a whole bunch of ways in which our faith gets sideways, in which our faith gets sick. So here's the first one. It's diagnosing when faith gets sick. It's when faith amounts to religious activity and not a relationship. And it's the opportunity for us to evaluate, to judge people based on their behavior rather than their identity in who they are by putting their faith and trust in the Jesus of the Bible. Here's how Paul talks about it in verse 16. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. So what are they talking about there? They're talking about diet and they're talking about days, right? And especially when you see the word Sabbath there's a really good indication that these Gnostic teachers, these people who came and said, Jesus is good, but you got to do more, actually took some of that more out of the Bible, because back in Leviticus chapter 11, there's a whole bunch of things, ceremonially speaking, that God put in place that were supposed to be giant fingers pointing in the direction that one day somebody who was going to come, who was going to represent all that we are seeking to do and even put in the fabric of our faith. But one day the reality of that will come, and that's going to be Jesus. And so these were tools that would take people in that sort of direction there. Ceremonial laws that were meant to give people an understanding. What does it mean, to be in relationship with a holy God? What does that look like? But one day there was going to be the fulfillment of that. And so what God gave to us are tools that would just draw us in God's direction and make our faith really understand what it means to belong to God. But here's what these Gnostic teachers were doing. They took a tool and now they're turning it into a rule. And they're drawing a line and saying, if you're on that side of the line over with us, you're good. But if you're on the other side of the line, you know what? We can evaluate your heart just based on what you do on the outside. Diet and days. You ever had an experience like that where somebody judged you because of either diet or days? We got all these funky diets in our day, and they're like, oh, you're going to have a donut, and so many times, we have these weird sort of ideas around that. I can tell you a conversation I had many years ago on the East Coast, and it was with a lady, and we were in a store, and there was, my wife was shopping and doing something, and we just struck up this conversation and found out, she believed in God and walked with God and all of this, but eventually it got around to, she asked the question, well, what day do you worship on? What day do you gather for worship? I said, well, we gather all together on Sundays. And she goes, well, you're going to hell. I thought, wow, that conversation took a big turn. And it was all about you worship on the wrong day. And right here's this whole idea of Sabbath. And it had been turned into this legalistic sort of idea that if you don't do it the right way, I can just evaluate you by your outward behavior, where your heart stands before God. But what was Sabbath all about from the very beginning? Why did God put that in there? It's one of the 10 Commandments, for goodness sakes. Here's what Sabbath is about. It was an opportunity for us to know and understand that God is the provider of all things. And one day we cease and desist from what we normally do. And in doing that, not only is God not anti just, burn yourself out, but God is the one who supplies all of our needs. And it was meant to teach us that lesson as we put into this rhythm of our lives that God is the provider of all things. And God can take care of my needs. And I don't have to make it happen all the time. But all of a sudden, one of those tools that would lead us in the direction of what it means to be connected to God was now focused more on the finger rather than what the finger was ultimately pointing to. And if you want maybe the memorable quote of the day, don't focus on the finger. Focus on what is pointing toward. And so don't turn a tool into a rule. And so with diets and days, here's what Paul goes on to say about them. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. When you see a shadow of somebody, you see a shadow, maybe if you're married, of your spouse, would you hug a shadow when you had the reality? No, you wouldn't do that. There's nothing to that. Would you hug a shadow of your pet when you have the pet that's there? See, reality casts a shadow. The shadow doesn't have any reality. It's just pointing to it. And so often, though, here's what happens. is that we have some experience, and maybe it's one of the many ways in which God has allowed us to engage our faith and to point us in the direction of being alive with God. And we take one experience and we can make that sort of a universal rule that we apply to everybody. Well, we do this in this way, therefore everybody should do it in that way because that's what God used in my life. And maybe you've gone to different churches and had different experiences. You know, here when we have communion, and we do that on the first Sunday of every month, we have the little plastic shot glasses, you know, that have the grape juice in them. And I don't know if you've ever gone to a different sort of experience. I've been in a church where you go up to the front and they got one cup. And, you know, going up there, you know, the first person who took a sip, and there was like a spit bridge, you know, that was from their mouth down to the cup, and I'm thinking, what are we doing right now? It's cold and flu season too on top of that. This is insanity. This is craziness. Why do we do this? And we can get so bound up in the expression of something that we say, well, the way that we do it and the way that I've experienced it is the way that everybody needs to do it. But instead, so many of those things are a giant finger pointing us in the direction of life with God. But we can turn the tool into a rule, and when we do that, we often miss what it was pointing to in an ultimate sense. So what are we saying about faith? Faith is not about trying harder, but it is about trusting more. And so often what we do is we can say, okay, if I want to get serious about God and I want to be committed, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I got to know the exact right way to do it. And so when it comes even to the day on which we worship, what day is that and how do we do that and when does it begin and when does it end? Here's what we discover when the church is born in the New Testament. You know what day they worshiped? Sunday, followed by Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Every day was an opportunity for that. And what a mistake it is for us to take something that was meant to make us alive with God, but now define it by hard and fast rules of when it begins and when it ends, and if you're not doing that right, you're going to hell. What was it pointing toward? Don't focus on the finger. Focus on what it was pointing toward. Am I growing my faith from the outside in or from the inside out? Because legalism says, you know what? The truth is out there. And you got to engage the truth in very real ways. And when you do that and you do what you're supposed to do on the outside, it will work its way into your heart and life. Here's what the Apostle Paul just got done saying in the previous section of Colossians. No, you are dead. And God makes you alive. And our faith grows from the inside out. And so how are you growing your faith? So diagnosing when faith gets sick, here's the second way that Paul's going to talk about. It's when faith equals valuing methods and not the mission. Valuing methods and not the mission. So our methods are the things that we do, but the mission is the overall direction in which God is calling us to go, which is really following after him in the direction in which he is going. So here's how he talks about it. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. Such a person also goes into great detail about what they have seen. They are puffed up. Another word for that would be pride, with idle notions by their unspiritual minds. So let me, give you a little insight into what was happening there, because Paul's talking about something very specific to their situation. These Gnostic teachers, these false teachers came to people who were seeking to follow after Jesus, and here's what they taught. They taught that there is God in heaven, but none of us can approach God in and of ourselves. And so God has all these emanations that between who God is and who we are, there are all these spiritual beings. And for them, many of them represented angels of different types. And so they had experiences and encounters with angels that they believed over time would actually put them in touch with God, but nobody can approach God all on their own. The Bible tells us this, that between God and humanity, there's one mediator, and that's Jesus Christ. But they were teaching to have these encounters with angels, to have these visions, to have these experiences. The belief was also that as they engaged these angels, that they were receiving some revelation and some visions that they would pass on to the people. And so when you see that and experience that, here's what they were saying to the people. You need to have the same experience that we have, because the experience that we have puts us in touch with God, but you're not good enough to approach God all on your own. So you need to be doing what we're doing. And the principle there, right, is to take one experience and turn that into an expectation for everybody. And to say what we are experiencing is what everybody needs to experience. Here's what Paul says. What's the result of that? They have lost connection with the head. Was he talking about connection with the head? Back in chapter 1 of Colossians, Jesus was called the head of his body, the church. So he's saying what they're doing in their experience is actually decapitating them spiritually, because they are losing connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as, would you say this next phrase with me? God causes it to grow. Does our faith grow by what we do? Or is it that God grows our faith as we engage our faith? And see, the thing is, this is especially tempting and luring, because who doesn't want to have a deeper experience with God? I do. And maybe you've experienced that at one point or another in your life. Maybe you just, wept and laughed at the same time, and it felt like you were standing under a waterfall of God's grace that just poured out on you. And we go, yeah, who doesn't want that? But here's the thing, and here's where it becomes tricky and where it can turn our faith sick and become ill, is that when we pursue the experience more than what the experience is supposed to help us understand. And so now it is not, a tradition or an activity that points us in a certain direction. Now we're elevating experience to the point of saying, it's all about that, and ultimately that is what connects me with God. I heard this story a number of years ago. There was it's a church in Australia, where they would have these amazing times with musicians who would play, and the experience that was there was just this captivating sort of experience. Well, the leadership of that church decided at one point in time, you know what? It seems as though people are coming for the experience, almost kind of like getting a spiritual high. And then when that wears off, well, I got to come back and get another spiritual high. And we're just riding the waves of these spiritual highs, because even what we do here, what is it ultimately about? It's not about that. Ultimately, it is about connecting us to God. And so you know what they did at that church for a period of time? Talk about radical. They just stopped doing music for about 6 months. And they said, you know what? We're just not going to do that anymore, because I think we've turned something, an experience, into an ultimate thing, but that was supposed to connect us with God in life-giving ways. But instead, it's led us away from him. So what is the point? Even at Washington Heights Church, what are we here to do? Whether it's, Sunday or any other day, the point is ultimately to help people meet and follow. And the next word is the most important word in that phrase, Jesus. Helping people meet and follow Jesus. But what we can do instead is we can strive for certain experiences. And sometimes, even when we experience something profound, one of the mistakes that we can make is, well, that's how God worked in my life and grew my faith in my life. And so that needs to be the experience that everybody has. And yet God is not restricted to just one way. There's no style of music that goes all the way back to the time of Jesus. There's no building structure that goes all the way back to Jesus. There's not one structure of what a church looks like and sounds like that goes all the way back. What is it supposed to be about? It is supposed to be about Jesus. And so when we talk about, these different preferences that we have, and you've probably heard us say this if you've been around here for a while, church includes you, but it's not about you. What is it about? Ultimately, it's about Jesus and helping people meet and follow Jesus. You know what this means? Worship the giver, not the gift. And so often what we do is we take a gift of some experience, some way to engage our faith, and then we hold that up as the ultimate thing. But the ultimate thing is always Jesus. Worship Jesus, not the gifts that he gives. So let me ask you this question. Am I putting preferences over priority? Are there things that I like and things that God has used in my life, and I'm holding that up as a standard that if we are not doing that, therefore we are not truly honoring God and walking with God? Because there are many ways in which our personal tastes can become universal truths that we apply to everything and everyone. And when that happens, what did the Apostle Paul say? It disconnects us from the head, because ultimately God causes our faith to grow. One more way that Paul diagnoses when our faith gets sick, it's when faith equals keeping rules and not transformation. And isn't this the common perception of people that, might not be in a church today? I think it really is. That what faith in Jesus amounts to is just a whole bunch of rules. And I don't know if you grew up with this saying, but when I was a kid, I heard this: don't drink, smoke, cuss, or chew, or hang around with girls who do, right? And there's this sense in which there are certain rules, and you don't do those things, and you do these things, and that's what it amounts to. You just got to do these things. I heard about a guy who found a tract, and that's an old thing. It's kind of a little piece of paper that would be handed out to people and supposed to communicate, what it means to have a relationship with God. Well, this one was entitled, Jesus Says Don't. And on the cover was Jesus, and the eyebrows were raised. Jesus looked angry in that picture. And in that, it was 40 things not to do. Here's the first group. Don't have long hair. A couple of our staff members are in trouble already. Don't wear pearls. Yeah, a couple more. Don't study anything other than the King James Version. Don't tell jokes or use clowns or puppets to explain the Word of God. I'm on board with the clowns thing. Clowns are creepy, aren't they? Right? But the red puppets, I don't know where they got that. Don't say no whenever asked for money. Don't join the armed forces. Don't join a union. And there's 33 left to go. But as we read that, does that just feel liberating, or does that feel like a burden? And I think that is the common perception of people today, that what it means to journey along with God is just do that and don't do that, where the rules become this solid line and it's real clear which side of that line you stand. But the Apostle Paul has said, you know what? Jesus gave you life so that you could be free. Free to do what? You're not free to sin. And sometimes people go, yeah, I'm free. I can do anything I want. Yeah, you know what? You can. But when we do that, one of the ways in which that displays where our hearts is that it shows that Jesus is not the leader of our lives. See, we're not free to sin. We're free from sin. We're free to follow Jesus in the direction in which he calls us. And so here's this part of this section here, this passage. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, and let me explain that. We talked about it last week. What is that? He's talking about this ancient pagan way of engaging the spirit world. And you do your part, and then the spirit world is obligated to do something on your behalf. And he says there's this whole contractual approach that we can have to our spiritual life. I do mine, and then you do yours. And he says you died to that. So why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? And there's this whole idea that rules ultimately equals, the depth and commitment of my spirituality. And often what we do is we take those things and we hold them up as the ultimate sign of where we might stand or where somebody else might stand with God. Notice how he goes on. He says, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. There are a whole bunch of rules that are a bunch of do nots, and often that is the direction in which people think that's what this is all about. And I think there's ways in which we can, say that what might be smart for you doesn't always need to be a universal truth for everybody. So for example, just to give you one example of what that might look like, how about educating our kids? I can remember years ago being a pastor on the East Coast, and somebody came up to me and this is a quote, "When are we going to tell people in this church that if they love their kids, they're going to homeschool their kids?" And I said, you know when we're going to say that? A week after never is when we're going to say that. Now, if God's called you to homeschool your kids, that's great. If God's called you to send your kids to a Christian school, that's great. If God's called you to put your kids in public school, I'm a product of public school, and if you look at your, well, let's send them somewhere else because, and here's why my wife and I never decided to homeschool our kids. You know why? Because we didn't want to murder our children is why we didn't, so we sent them off to public school. And again, we can take one of those things as, the direction in which God is leading me, but now when we apply that to everybody, what we've created is a rule, and we're automatically assessing their heart by what they are doing with their external activity. And the Apostle Paul says, we got to be very careful because that'll make our faith sick. And it will take us in the direction of legalism instead of life that is lived together with God in profound ways. And so he goes on, these rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teaching. So what does Paul say? He says a couple things about going the rules direction. See, the first one, they're destined to perish. They don't last. They don't last forever. And it seems like whatever the issue of a day is, in the next generation, that issue is gone, and there's a new issue that's popped up. And so, they're destined to perish because they're not the substance of anything eternal. They're just these moments in time where we bite the lure of drawing these hard and fast lines of where people stand based on activity and not identity. Can I give you one example? And I'm not making this one up. There was a denomination in Canada that a generation ago had this discussion. I kid you not. Can our shirts have buttons or are zippers allowed on any parts of a shirt? And a whole denomination split up over that whole issue. I was like, seriously? Right? But that was important in that moment in time, but what does it do? It perishes. And so those moment in time issues are not the things of eternal matters. They don't last. Second of all, he says they don't work. They are based merely on human commands and teachings, right? They're not coming from God. These are these man-made rules and lines and boundaries that we put in place that have nothing to do with the stuff of God. They don't last. They don't work. The do-nots do not work. And then he goes on with one final statement here. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom. It looks good, right? Looks wise, looks spiritual. With self-imposed worship, wow. Their false humility and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack how much value? Any value in restraining sensual indulgence. What is Paul saying? He's not saying, you know what, there's some good to it and you got to take it in measure and just in measurement and make sure you're not overdoing it. No, he's saying there's nothing good there. He's also telling us the issues that we face, the stuff that we struggle with, our issues are deeper than the things that we can solve on the surface level and by external activity. That they're issues of the heart and they are deep down in the heart, and he is not saying, you know what, no change and no transformation, that's not really important. It really is important. It really is good. Sobriety in our life from whatever it is that ails us and that plagues us at a deep level, getting free of that is a really good thing. But here's what he's saying. It doesn't happen with the rules. It doesn't happen with legalism. That never brings us to life. Instead, it just bogs us down. So how does that happen? And see, the thing with rules is, you know what it often does? It forces us to focus on the very issue that we have. And I wonder, if you're trying to maybe overcome an alcohol issue in your life and you think, here's how I need to do it. Don't drink, don't drink, don't drink. What's my focus? Just drinking. Don't smoke, don't smoke, don't smoke. Focused on smoking. Don't watch porn, don't watch porn, don't watch porn. And then we wonder, why does nothing ever change? And we're so focused on our issue, and we think that somehow just putting a rule there will have the power to stop us from going in that direction. And you go, okay, well, what else we got? How are we supposed to overcome that? In the next few verses, in the beginning of chapter 3 of Colossians, Paul says these words, set your mind on things above, and not on earthly things, but on heavenly things. So you know what the solution is to our transformation, to us honestly and truly changing at a deep level? It is not staring down our issue every day and mustering up our willpower to try to overcome it. Instead, we redirect our focus, and we focus on the one who brings us to life, and we focus on the one who fuels our faith. But what we often do is we take rules and we turn that into fuel that we think will somehow lead us into a whole new way of life, and it doesn't work. The do nots do not work. But instead, there is an opportunity for us to focus on the one who can transform us and make us over. So, what are we making our faith about? Make your faith more about what God is doing in you rather than what you are doing for God. And so often we can look to our efforts, to our commitment, to our activity. But what is happening deep down inside of who we really are? And what life is God pouring into you that you get to work out into your life? Rather than trying to build our faith from the outside in. God, look how sincere I am. Are you growing closer to him? Are you connected to him? Are you looking to him for transformation? Because that is the only place that can be found. Am I more focused on Jesus or my sin? Am I more focused on Jesus or the issues that plague me day after day after day? Because if we're focused on the issue, it's not going to change. That our hearts will go in the direction of our focus. And if our focus is on Jesus, it can change everything. So what does all this mean in the bigger picture of things? Here's what Paul's saying. Don't let religion keep you from Jesus. And boy, religion looks so great. And legalism is a religion of human achievement. That it's up to me, myself, and I at the end of the day. Paul said, nope. It is completely an act of God. It is divine accomplishment. It is D-O-N-E in Jesus, and not D-O on your part and my part. It is not what we do. It is what Jesus has done in our connection to him and our desire to journey together with him. That changes everything. Would you stand together with me? And I'm going to close our time and we will be dismissed. So God, thank you for who you are and the opportunity to be in a relationship with you. And God, would you just help us to know that that is your doing from beginning to end? And may that result in tremendous gratitude on our parts and just a desire to honor you and walk with you, and help us to know that we are free to follow you and all that you have for us. And so God, may you take from us any idea that we might have that at the end of the day, it's up to us. It's up to you, and you've already done what was needed for us to belong to you and walk with you and live a life full of a vibrant faith that just pursues you and all that you have for us. Lead us in that direction, God, for your name's sake. We ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys. Thank you for being here. We'll see you soon.